So first of all, thank you all for coming, and also thanks to Anna, who organized this, and for Katia making it happen. This book is based on my dissertation, and so it's been a long time that these ideas have been around. And when I finished my dissertation and I was a professor in the US, I was trying to publish my dissertation as a book, and the title was Action and Contemplation in the Politics of Fin de siècle Italy. And apparently nobody wanted to publish it, and I don't know why. So at the time I had a friend who worked for the same publishing company that publishes Game of Thrones, so he was dealing with fantasy novels proposals. So I said to him, but why, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, would you mind taking a look at my proposal? And he said, sure, and after a week he said to me, you know, Elena, after 3 lines, I just wanted to fall asleep. It's really boring. Can you make it more exciting? And I said, well, why is it so that in this country everything has to be exciting? It's an academic book. It's supposed to be profound and boring. He said, yes, but it's not catchy. And you need to attract the reader's attention. So I see that you put something about desire down there. Can you please make it about desire? Because desire is sexy, it's catchy. And I said, but do you mean that I have to rewrite the whole book? He said, well, maybe just a proposal for the moment, and then you see. So I did, because I was also interested in desire. I did think it was a much better topic. So it took me about 2-3 days, and then I reshaped the whole proposal. Did send it out to the first publisher, it was Fairleigh Dickinson, and after a week they got back to me and said, great, we're interested in publishing, do send the manuscript. Just that I had not written a thing. So I kept them waiting for about a year, doing like Penelope's Web, like doing it and undoing, saying, yeah, it's coming. And then after a year and a half, I finally submitted my manuscript, so here it is. And thanks to my friend Jonathan, who's not here, but who helped me, writing an exciting proposal. Also, again, thanks to you. And so if you ever feel like falling asleep, so yes, we can start. You guys can start asking a question. We can start the conversation.
Do you want to start with the questions, or do you want to say something, or you sort of in response you will
I'll respond to
okay.
Whatever you say.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm Katia Pizzi. I'm based here, and I'm very happy to meet you all. And especially, I'm delighted to be launching Elena's book tonight. But I also have to say that in asking questions, because this is not my field, I'm stepping in the shoes of Lucia Vedovi, who regrettably cannot be with us.
Yes.
So you may find that that there's a sort of that there may not seem to be such a personal investment in the questions which have been largely given to me. But the topic is, of course, a really exciting one. And I'm delighted to kick off.
Thank you very much. I meant to say that too, that unfortunately there was this last-minute cancellation on my other respondent, but Katia very bravely stepped in. I'm also very lucky to have James Ackhurst all the way from New Zealand.
Well, I'm all the way from New Zealand, but I also happen to be on the 3rd floor.
Okay.
That's handy.
So I work in that library for about a month every year, but I do live in New Zealand. So we've been collaborating on a translation of Pascoli across the oceans and across the world. Yeah,
so we are actually collaborating on the first, well, not the first, but the newest translation of Poemi Conviviali, which is a work written by Giovanni Pascoli in 1905. And so in this talk, we're also going to talk a bit about the challenges of translating this poet into English, and maybe you guys can get a glimpse, a little bit of our work. We published one poem, and the other one is unpublished, so it's still somewhat of a draft. But maybe we'll have some time for poetry reading, which might be interesting. Thank you.
Okay, so I kick off with a quotation from the beginning of your book, and you say, I quote, that preoccupation of the 19th and early 20th century with desire in all its manifestation is something that is a great concern of your book. So can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yes. So desire is so prominent in the literature of the fin de siècle, but not just Italy, I mean France, Germany, England too, because it's the same time at which the unconscious was emerging as a notion. And this idea of a hidden dimension within us that surfaces in mental pathologies, in dreams, in wishes, really manifests itself primarily through desire. So it is through desires that we come to this knowledge. And I was fascinating to see, I call sort of desire the John the Baptist of the unconscious, because really all those texts that I analyze and more, not just philosophical texts, but also the findings of experimental psychology, in primis hysteria, desire is everywhere. And not just desire, but will, volition, impulse, instinct, and all of those, I take them as a whole, I take desire as an umbrella term to encompass all of those, because in all of those, in different degrees of consciousness, there is this hidden force that makes us want things. And so this notion that we are not completely rational when we want something. We want something because we think it's rational, but really it is not, was becoming prominent at that point. So there's lots of texts where this constellation of ideas come about. So I became fascinated with the way writers and artists engaged with desire in the end of the fin de siècle.
So desire is obviously something that people have known about for a while. We have desires, and it goes right the way back to the classical period. Plato and various other authors, Augustine. So can you talk a little bit about how this gets to the 20th century, or at least the late 19th century?
So the ancestor of desire is Plato in the Symposium, where he talks about eros as desiredness, as something as constantly being poor. The subject who desires is constantly on the lookout for something, is always looking for something, is on the quest for something. Eros is poor, and as poor, he is always trying to purchase something. And this idea of desire stemming from a lack, we desire something because we don't have what we want, is basically the crucial feature of desire, all the way to Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was an influential author in the fin de siècle, especially in Italy. And what Schopenhauer says is that within us there's an immanent will, and the will just wants to propagate itself. And so it makes us want things. It seems like we get to an object and we are satisfied, but no, the will continues on to another subject. It's never satisfied. And therefore we are constantly on this suffering path of constantly wanting something. But I think truly the best way of somewhat defining this idea of desires, constantly moving on to other objects, is, I find it in Fitzgerald, The Beautiful and the Damned. And so I wanted to read this quote because it's much better than any philosophical explanation. And that taught me that you can't have anything at all, because desire just cheats you. It's like a sunbeam skipping here and there about a room. It stops and gilds some inconsequential object, and we poor fools try to grasp it. But when we do, the sunbeam moves on to something else, and you've got the inconsequential part, but the glitter that makes you want it is gone. And this line of thoughts brings us to Jacques Lacan. Jacques Lacan is the father somewhat of the notion of desire in the 20th century. And Lacan postulates a lack at the base of every desire. Desire is engendered by a constant lack, as desire is made of an infinite demand for love, which in life is unattainable. It is also linked to jouissance, a sense of excitement and pleasure that comes to replace in adult life the lost unity of mother and child, constituting itself as a fantasy of wholeness. And this idea of wholeness, the primeval pleasure that we experience as children, also according to Freud, is what fuels desire. Desire is just an attempt to repeat this initial feeling of pleasure. So in one way, this is one line of thinking on desire. Also, it's important to highlight that for this line of thinking, the mechanism of desire is a constant slipping from one object to the next, called a metonymical slip, because the object itself is never the end of desire, it's just a part of it. But on the other hand, we also have another line of thinking which highlights the productivity of desire. For instance, Spinoza talks about conatus, desire, as something that keeps us alive, because if we didn't want things, we wouldn't be alive. If we didn't want to have food and water, we wouldn't be on this earth, so it what keeps us there. And then we have, in the 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century, Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is the enemy of Schopenhauer when it comes to desire. And for him, he hates Schopenhauer and his idea that we need to renounce desire because it's bad. So for him, all desires are good, and they all convey into what he calls the will to power. Even bad desires are good, because, as he says, and I brought a quote here, you need to pursue your worst or best desires. In both cases, you are probably still in some way a promoter, a benefactor of mankind, meaning that it's what we produce as desiring subject that makes the world continue to be and produce things. We also, in one way, there's a brotherhood between Nietzsche in this regard and Deleuze and Guattari, whom I also quote heavily in the text. There is no such thing as the absence of desire. We can't avoid desire, and this is why the way we function, in fact, a society that represses desire expresses the desire to be repressed. Mm-hmm. And desire for Deleuze is what constitutes the fields of human relationship. We are desiring machines, and we are connected to each other through the desire that we have. So in one way, in my book, I deal with these two main representations of desire, which were present at the fin du siècle, and the writers that I deal with, they variously play with this idea.
So the sort of natural sort of follow-up to this is you name desire as the fil rouge that goes through the works of D'Annunzio and Pascoli. So can you tell us more how desire, is sort of congealed in that work, and how it pans out? I mean, it seems to me that D'Annunzio it sort of makes more sense from a sort of general public viewpoint, but in Pascoli that's far more intriguing to know what you think, or how desire comes about.
So yes, so no two figures could have been more different than these two authors. That, however, in the fin du siècle they often publicize their spiritual brotherhood, because they are the two main literary figures of late 19th century Italy. Gabriele D'Annunzio, the flashier one of the two, lived an incredible life. He was a dandy. He was the equivalent of the French décadent. He was then a politician, and then finally war hero. He was imitated, hated, criticized, but on the mouth of everyone. So he himself defined his own life, il vivere inimitabile, the inimitable life, for the variety of experiences he had. In his way, desire is, in one way, the hatred of boredom and the constant request for different stimuli, but it's also somewhat of a dark force, splitting the subject in two. And in particular, for D'Annunzio himself, but more interesting for the figures of his novels, it's the erotic experience that really epitomizes the mechanism of desire, because in the conquest of a woman, and then in the apex of love, and then the dissatisfaction then finally ensues, it's exactly the mechanism that was explained in the quote by Fitzgerald, and therefore the compulsion to repeat, because no conquest could ever fulfill the immensity of desire. So in his novel, D'Annunzio puts into play this kind of desire, so promise of wholeness that everyone seems to hold, and the inability of the man to heal himself through the wholeness that the woman promises. So there are these two kinds of notions of desire. At the same time, D'Annunzio he read Nietzsche early on, and of all the complexity of Nietzsche, he really embraced one thing, that we need to love desire, we need to embrace the will to power. So he tries somehow to come to terms with these two experiences in his life, the constant dissatisfaction that comes with desire, and then the sanctification of desire that he takes from Nietzsche. Pascoli, on the other hand, lived a completely different life. He was a university professor and a famous poet, but lived all of his life in poverty, in country houses with his unmarried sister. He never married, he never had any relationship. His life was marked early on by the murder of his father, and then the passing away of most of his family, except the two sisters, who then went to live with him. And so most scholarly criticism has pointed out that trauma, this kind of trauma, is at the root of Pascoli's poetry. And Pascoli weaves this experience of death incessantly in his poems. But really, for Pascoli, desire is also twofold. On the one hand, it's greed. It's what needs to be eliminated. He agrees with Schopenhauer because it's the pain of the world. It's what makes men want more than they should, and therefore clash with each other. But desire, more interestingly, it's the promise of wholeness. It's the repetition of the happiness of childhood that can never be achieved in life. And we don't see this so much explicitly in his text, but we see it in the way his poetry works at textual level. Because I read Pascoli through Castello, and I read his poem as an attempt to recreate the semiotic, which is this early condition, this experience of union of mother and child before language comes about. So Pascoli's poems, in one way, for those of you who are familiar with them, they expose this type of language, which is semiotic, because they're rhythmic, they're musical. They equate the song of birds with English, Latin, Greek, Italian, and this is not something logical, it's not a message there, but it is the joy and the pleasure of rhythm, which has to do with primeval experience of childhood. Also for Pascoli, poetry, like memory, does bring about the memory of childhood, and it is within this space that poetry is a function in one way. So I deal also with this particular interpretation of desire in Pascoli.
So when we're talking about Plato and Augustine and stuff, it's all a bit sort of lofty, you know, the ladder of love and all these things. So when you were talking about D'Annunzio and sex, I wanted to bring in Darwin, because obviously Darwin's ideas and works are having an influence throughout after a certain point in the 19th century. So how does that more sort of brutish concept of desire play into these authors?
So you bring in Darwin, and so, which is a big jump. So, Charles Darwin was very popular in the fin de siècle Italy too. He was one of those authors, like later on Freud, that everybody quoted without actually having read any of the books. And we're talking about two main texts, The Origin of Species and The Descent of Man. And when these two texts were published in Italy, immediately they were hailed as, not as an hypothesis, as Darwin wanted them to be, but as a proven theory. A proven theory of what is going to happen to mankind. Mankind will evolve from being prone to impulses and instincts and evil desire to become fully rational, to completely master all impulses. And where do they take that? They take that from a small passage in Darwin's The Descent of Man, in which he says that it's good for the human species to, just like it happens to animals, to privilege the social instinct, because if we don't damage, if we don't hurt our fellow people, then there's a higher chance that we survive as a community. So he says in a few lines after that it is possible that in the future men will learn to dominate these most dangerous impulses for the sake of surviving as a community. So now this 2-3 sentences, and this, in one way, for Darwin was just a working idea, and hypothesis, became in late 19th century Italy a whole speculation on evolutionism, of a speculation of an evolutionistic nature, and it became really a part of the mindset, especially of the elite that ruled unified Italy. It became their, somehow, cultural program. One famous example of the appropriation of Darwin theory is Cesare Lombroso, whom I'm sure you've heard of. Lombroso says that basically mankind will finally become more and more prone to dangerous instincts. But he also says that at the current, nowadays, at the current time, there are certain individuals, such as criminals, women, children, who are more than others similar to animals, so similar to our ancestors. And in one way, the danger of regressing to the brute, it's always there. So in one way, this evolutionistic mindset with the idea of the brute within us that manifests us in impulses, and it manifests us more in certain categories of individual, create one way a paradigm of a split subject. So man is not unified, man is not like Cartesian, it's not one, it's not rational, it's in the making, it's a subject in the making that evolves towards perfect rationality, but is still threatened inside by the beast within. And what is this beast within? Well, for D'Annunzio it would be the erotic impulse, which is the key signature of our ancestors. But it's not just D'Annunzio, it was really everywhere in Italian fantasy. I brought a quote from another very famous writer that explains that in better words than I have. Antonio Fogazzaro, another popular writer at the time. Often I thought that I felt deep in my heart the turmoil of the various inferior lives from which, step by step, human nature emerged. A turmoil that has strange and impetuous tides, that sometimes climbs up and cries within my heart with 1,000 greedy and sinister bestial cries, and then, once it is satisfied and sated, sinks down, leaving a sad silence behind. Moral dignity consists in struggling with our kinship to the brute, which is in constant battle with the principle unknown to it, moral consciousness. So, yes, so in one way Darwin, it's also interesting because this appropriation of Darwin creates an anthropological paradigm that precedes Freud, because we can see in these images of the brute inside and then the perfectly rational man at the end point of evolution, somehow a Freud in the making, in the es and the superego, and at the time now, we are in the intermediate phase, so there's still a danger to progress to the brute.
So you've already answered part of my next question, but what about Schopenhauer then in fin de siècle, Italy?
Mm-hmm. So Schopenhauer published The World as Will and Representation in 1819. So for a long time his writings were not known in Italy, but in the 1980 and 90 they became extremely popular. This because there was a small group of intellectuals living in Florence, Angelo Orvieto, Angelo Conti, who were open to foreign influence in it. This was rare in Italy because at the time the cultural climate was completely different. They opened themselves up to French symbolism, British pre-Raphaelism, Ruskin, Pater, and through them Schopenhauer. And what they really took from Schopenhauer was the idea that art suppresses desire, so in one way suppresses the beast within, so this is the connection. Art is one of those few experiences in which we look at something beautiful, it can be art but it also can be nature, and we don't want it, we just want to stand in front of them. And those few moments, it's sort of a spiritual experience in which desire quenches itself. So this idea, it's in The World as Will and Representation, and became the foundation of a new conception of art, which in French was l'art pour l'art. and initially was sustained by this notion of art as having a function, becoming valid per se, because it has a spiritual, it's a spiritual tool of purification from desire. And these writers also inspired Pascoli. Pascoli was close to them. In fact, his idea of desire is very, in one way, similar to Schopenhauer, although, as maybe I will discuss later, sort of different, but in one way aligned to this idea that art is not a means of propaganda, but beauty per se is valid. So Schopenhauer enters this picture that way, as sustaining a notion of art that has in itself its raison d'être.
Thank you. And so how does the demonization of desire bring about the ultimate dream of the body machine in early 20th century?
So we need to think of what is the end point of evolution really? If we started as brutes and then we are evolving towards more and more rational forms of existence, what is really the end point of evolution? So in one way, this speculation on evolution brings about a reflection on the posthuman. What is the posthuman? And at the beginning of the 20th century, people began to imagine that the interaction of man and machine will give man not only prosthetic organs to make them more powerful, to go faster, go places faster, to go up to the sky, to go to where they have never been before, but also that it would have a psychological effect that would make men more resilient to desire, to impulses, because they would be like machines. We find this in the writing of Mario Morasso, who's a very interesting figure, in many ways precedes and anticipates futurism. He wrote a book called The New Weapon, The Machine, and in this book he talks about desire, and he says, in the modern metropolis, desires multiply, because in modern metropolis, the new society, the democratic society, is no longer divided between rich kings and poor subjects, but we all somewhat can achieve something. We can achieve more than in the past. So this multiplies desire. He has a very compelling description of the nervous life of the metropolis, in which people move faster, people live faster, and this multiplies the amount of desire that we can have, because we have something and then we can have something else the next day. And so, and how can people dominate? Which generation can withstand this pressure? He foresees a generation with nerves of gigantic vigor. He talks about that. And he says, because we will deal so much with machines, the machine will also give us a little bit of its power and resilience. The modern man who is in touch with his brute and gigantic force, who subdues and guides it, will not lose his course, and he will reach his goal even in other crazy runs, those of passion and desire. He has given a bit of his heart to the monster of metal and fire, but the monster has given him in return some of its power and strength. We also take into account that at the beginning of the 20th century, this speculation of the posthuman marries very well with the diffusion of the Übermensch of Nietzsche. And after all, what is the Übermensch? The Übermensch is a man who has contained all his desire, channeled among the will to power. He's not dominated by his desire, but he dominates and he acts upon them in this will that is perfectly rational and perfectly conscious. But in one way, if desire is perfectly conscious and rational, it's no longer a desire, we're no longer humans, we are machines. And D'Annunzio will also incorporate some of that in his last novel, in which the protagonist will turn into a plane. And we can see that's how it's really a futuristic image. It's Mafarka, the futurist.
It is, yes. And in fact, is the precursor of the metallization of men, of Marinetti, and
exactly.
The cyborg of Marinetti. Yes.
Exactly. So, but all of this is really sustained by the notion of desire, because this idea of being like a machine is to be less like a brute, is to finally come to terms with this dangerous threat within us.
Excellent. Very, very interesting. I think I'm sort of moving slightly away from D'Annunzio to go back to Pascoli now and his reading of Dante's Divine Comedy and the evolution of mankind from vita activa to vita contemplativa. Can you tell us a bit about that?
It seems like sometimes we're skipping from very different topics, but the thread is there, so I'm hoping to highlight it somehow. So what does the Divine Comedy have to do with all of this? Well, first of all, Pascoli was a poet, but also a renowned university professor. He was actually probably more known at the time as a university professor than as a poet. And he had this greatest ambition of becoming famous as a Dante scholar. So he wrote 4 books of Dantean criticism, which he hoped would give him notoriety. They didn't. Not only while he was alive, but even after he was dead. In fact, I think I'm one of the only people, I mean, they can be counted on a hand, that has ever read the whole of Dante's, Pascoli's Dantean scholars. They're extremely cumbersome to read, they're very, very obscure, and that explains why they were not successful during his lifetime. They were also not successful because at the time, the way people studied Dante was mostly philological, so people aimed at reconstructing the history of the Divine Comedy, the world of Dante. Pascoli does none of that. He doesn't care at all to reconstruct what Dante wanted to say. He had a particular idea in mind of what the Divine Comedy was. For him, it was the evolution of mankind from the brute to the completely moral man that he calls the Homo humanus. And not just that, it's also the evolution of the individual from childhood to adulthood. And it's also the passage from vita activa to vita contemplativa, where vita activa, the life of action, in one way signifies the time where desires and ambitions are at play, and vita contemplativa is where contemplation really is a Schopenhauer concept after all, where desire is no longer there, where it's been subdued and then finally mastered. And so all of his Dantean reading aims at that. It's a proto-structuralist reading. That's why it's so cumbersome, because he really tries to make everything match to this great message. I don't know if probably many of you are familiar with the structure of the Divine Comedy, but Dante is lost in a dark wood and then is taken by a virgin through hell and then to heaven. So for Dante, the life of the individual and the beginning of mankind begins in a dark wood. And this dark wood signifies, in a way, it takes the Aristotelian notion of vegetation as the beginning of all forms of life. It signifies a state of mind that is completely instinctual, like children are in one way, or maybe teenagers, maybe at the beginning of our life we're before good and evil, we're before judgment. And from that, Virgil takes him to see hell, which is the life of action gone astray, when ambitions and desire of achieving something have been, in one way, gone into bad hands. And after that, through the forest of Eden, Dante gets to see heaven, and heaven signifies the end point of evolution, again, the Homo humanus. Interestingly, Pascoli reads Dante through Darwin, and it's very clear here, it actually mentions evolution. Dante believed in a mysterious grace similar to the moon in the night sky, which makes men grow out of their vegetal entanglement. Now, science does not explain how men became men, but it uses a word, evolution, that repeats the question without answering it, with a word as mysterious as grace. So for him, the Divine Comedy is really a poem of desire, a poem of the abandonment of desire. It's also interesting that for him, this idea of the dark wood, of this completely pulsional phase, makes him a predecessor of Freud, because he has the same twofold notion of childhood. On the one hand, childhood as purity, as innocence, but also childhood as a time where there is no boundary, there is no morality, because rationality is not there, because people don't make rational informed judgments. And so the whole divine comedy for Pascoli becomes that. He also becomes his own personal story, the abandonment of glory, because Pascoli did want glory, did want notoriety, had desires himself, but they never came true. So in one way, it takes the divine comedy to reflect his own path as a human being.
So the Forest of Eden, can you talk a bit more about that as a sort of locus of poetry, basically?
Yes. So if we, briefly go back to what I said before about the dark forest, hell, heaven. In between, there's the Forest of Eden. In the Forest of Eden, Dante, in the poem, meets Matella. Matella is a woman with a merry and childlike attitude that picks and sings and picks flowers. And for Pascoli, that signifies poetry. But what is really the Forest of Eden in the picture of the evolution of mankind? It's childhood regained, not childhood as a completely pulsional phase, as the bad childhood of the beginning, but it's childhood as a state of mind, the state of mind that we reconstitute when we contemplate beauty, or when we are in touch with the memory of our infancy. And so this is the locus of poetry. And poetry has a good function, as a spiritual function, because it restores that childhood in the soul of people. That's why Pascoli was, in one way, aligned with Schopenhauer in saying that art has a purifying function, but he also goes a bit beyond, because he doesn't believe in l'art pour l'art. He doesn't believe that we should sit in our ivory tower and just do art for the sake of it. We should do art because art is the religion of mankind. In the absence of God, the only religion that is possible is the spirituality that comes from creating myth and creating stories that can restore the purity in one hand and also can make us more brothers. This is more somewhat cheesy reflection on that we should all be brothers and not hurt each other and not clash against each other. But the Forest of Eden is the opposite of the dark forest, and it's childhood in the to the other face of this bifrons representation of childhood as purity, as not as dominion of desire.
That's brilliant. Can we go back to D'Annunzio's novels? And this is very, very interesting to me as well, because it seems to reflect a lot that Marinetti then does as well. You know, Marinetti is a sort of pseudo-D'Annunzio in many respects.
Yes.
You know, they sort of share a lot of their sort of intellectual or conceptual worlds. But let's turn in particular to the relationship between male characters and female characters in D'Annunzio's novels. And can you talk about a slippage of desire in this sort of mechanism of relationship, or is the woman the other as compared to the male counterpart?
The woman is the other, always, for D'Annunzio. So, D'Annunzio wrote several novels, all of them were very successful in Centro Siècle Italy. Most of them very hard to read for the modern reader, but they offer lots of interesting ideas for the scholar. If you think about Pascoli's voyage from vita activa to vita contemplativa, D'Annunzio does exactly the opposite. I read all of these novels as parables of desire, in which he puts into play different solutions to the problem of desire. He starts with the Schopenhauer solution of art as a purifying experience, but he abandons it immediately, and then progresses towards the incorporation of Nietzsche as a solution to the problem of desire. And then in his last novel, Forse che sì, forse che no, he puts into play the transformation of the body into a machine as the only possible solution to get rid of desire. I have to say that D'Annunzio knew very little of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, because he was famous for never reading anything but just hearing the things here and there and putting them together. He knew Schopenhauer through French translations, and he reviewed some of them for several journals that he worked for. He knew even less about Nietzsche, but what he knew, in his library in Gardone, I found the books that he had from Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. Most of them are unopened, but the books by Nietzsche, he underlined with several colors, blue and red, the parts about desire. So I was sure that he had a great interest in the topic. So in one way, in these novels, there's one plot, basically. It's only one plot. The man needs to possess the woman to heal his ruptured self. Typically, the man is split between a great erotic impulse, which torments the subject, and a very sophisticated intellectual mind. And this dichotomy makes the existence of the male protagonist, and probably D'Annunzio himself, unbearable. So he tries to possess the woman because the woman contains the promise of wholeness. It's only by possessing a woman that he hopes that the male protagonist hope to heal the rupture. But this never happens, and so the compulsion of repeat ensues.
It's interesting because in Marinetti, the woman is often the machine. It's a very complex landscape, but the woman is often turned into the machine as the other to possess and to.
Interesting. Because
but I think
the woman is progressively expelled from the narrative. At the beginning, it's that she's at the center and she's only the object of desire. You never know what women think in D'Annunzio's novels, ever.
But it's also very cruel. No?
It's very cruel, it's very sick, it's very morbid. And at the end, the woman becomes the subject of desire because she suffers and she's progressively expelled from the narrative. But in the first novel, The Child of Pleasure, which is probably the most readable, the only one probably readable, we have the Schopenhauer solution at play, and it is the immediate failure of Schopenhauer's solution. The protagonist named Andreas Perelli is the equivalent of the French décadent. He's a noble man, he's rich, he loves the arts, he's an amateur sculptor and poet, but what he mostly loves is women. He's a philanderer, he's a womanizer. And the novel revolves around the conquest of two women, Elena and Maria, and obviously Elena represents the sensuous woman and Maria represents the chaste Madonna type. And in the way he approaches his women, obviously, it's not just an erotic conquest per se, it's embedded in an artistic context, so that the woman is always compared to a work of art, and he needs to possess the woman to become an artist. Only by having a woman he feels art resurrecting into him. But basically, what really happens is that art is not a solution against desire, but it's the servant of desire. Because the way he gets the women into bed is by, in a way, turning this experience into sort of a spiritual and sophisticated experience. And in fact, art is only present in the absence of desire. So after he has slept with a woman, and when he's at some point is convalescent and sick. So in this scene of convalescence, art resurrects, in a very Schopenhauerian way. He quotes all the Eastern philosophies that Schopenhauer loved, Buddhism and so on, but then he meets another woman and soon enough, desire is still the protagonist. And so here what D'Annunzio is saying, that the way Schopenhauer sees art as a way of stopping desire doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. And in fact, the mockery of Schopenhauer is very well written inside the novel at the end, when there's an auction of all the things he has sold, and the first thing he sells is a statue of Buddha. And this is to say that Schopenhauer is mocked as a faulty solution. In The Intruder, same thing, pretty much the plot is the same, and there is this man who's a modern man, because for D'Annunzio the definition of modernity is the split self, is the analytical man that analyzes every whim and impulse of its mind, and at the same time he has this brute within. He really uses Darwinian categories all the time. I hear this beast inside of me, this obscure force, tormenting my days. In The Intruder, the man has a wife, and he has also many other lovers, but he decides to regain purity by concentrating on his wife and going on a holiday in the countryside. The woman is sick, who has been sick, and he actually takes particular pleasure in making love to his sick wife. So he also wonders how his sophisticated intellect is capable of such deranged pleasures. And but when he's there, he finds out that his saintly wife is pregnant by another man. narrative. There's also a narrative of the double, a play. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is quoted in the novel. And what it does is just to kill the child when the child is born. And here again, it's not particularly Schopenhauer that is criticized, but Tolstoy. Tolstoy was also quite popular in the fantasy. The Slavic morality of forgiveness and renunciation had also become, all the novels of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy had known great notoriety, and they were somewhat akin to Schopenhauer in this renunciation of all possible earthly desire. And in the novel, it's portrayed by another male character who's really a Tolstoyan character. And the protagonist tries to follow his lead, but cannot, and it's prone his impulses. The Triumph of Death is the mockery of Schopenhauer through Wagner, because it's the mockery of Tristan and Isolde. In the opera, Tristan and Isolde commit suicide at the end because their love is spiritual. They want to sublimate their desire by dying as a way of reconnecting themselves with the universe. In D'Annunzio's novels, again, the same protagonist, sophisticated, neurotic, a lover of arts, goes on holiday with his lover Hippolyta because he wants to heal his ruptured self, he wants to regain the unity of his soul. Hippolyta, on the other hand, is a very healthy woman who just wants to go on a holiday. And he has a fantastic time there, but the male protagonist doesn't, and he begins to hate the woman because she excites his desire, but she seems to be fine, while he is a victim of all of these torments. So he decides, there's a progression in the narrative in which he decides to kill the woman. And so he proceeds to kill her while listening to Tristan and Isolde. But while Tristan and Isolde commit suicide as a spiritual act, he tries to kill the woman, she resists, and he dies in the attempt. So in one way, it's really a mockery of this. It's the ultimate anti-Schopenhauer novel. After that, a new model, Nietzsche, comes about. And in The Maidens of the Rocks, we have another completely different picture in which the man is no longer tormented by desire, but it is a Nietzschean man, sort of a proto-Ubermensch. This time, the fault of the novel lies with the woman. In this novel, Claudio Cantelmo, that's the name, he tries to, he's a nobleman who wants to rejuvenate Italy, wants to be the new ruler of Italy, he needs to marry a princess of the nobility of Italy. So it's sort of a like fairy tale kind of story. So he goes about, because this is what he wants to do, he has a clear will, he is no longer a victim of any impulse, but he has a clear project in mind, a political project. But while he looks for a suitable bride, he finds out that of the 3 brides that he considers, all of them are prone to sickness and degeneration. One of them wants to become a nun. The other one is the classical Medusa woman, so not suited to procreation. And the other one is masculine and strong, but she needs to sacrifice herself for a dying father. And all of them live in a garden with 2 male brothers who are the epitome of the degenerate artists. They're sick, they're alcoholic, they're prone to STD. So in one way here, the fault, so the project of the protagonist fails, but not fails because of him, but because the woman is unable to provide a suitable companion. At the same time, in the portrayal of women, he really ridiculizes the stereotype of the bohemian artist, of the artist per se, of the French dandy. And the women are portrayed as sick and degenerate, and the brothers as well. And so here we have the progressive expulsion of the woman from the narrative by the woman taking all the negative characteristics. The women are also, in one way, they're depicted as hysteric. So in hysteria we see also the demonization of desire. And finally, The Flame, kind of the same plot. Here the artist, the protagonist is an artist who has a relation with an actress, and the actress is older than him. He needs her to put into play his theater, but at some point she becomes a burden for him because she's older and she can no longer provide the energy that he needs. Therefore he leaves her, and the woman becomes the suffering subject of desire, and the male is escaping this paradise. But even in The Flame, we still have somehow a repetition of the evilness of desire, because the novel is sort of cyclotimic in one way. On the one hand, the man is strong and free, on the other hand, is always somehow tainted by his sexual desire, he still feels towards the woman. Yeah, I put here a few quotes that in a way underline the passage from Schopenhauer to Nietzsche for him. First, he reviewed some of the main texts of, Hartmann is another philosopher that somehow has the same approach to desire as Schopenhauer, and then this is what I found in the book in his library. It was the passage that was underlined from the will to power. You are missing innocence in your desire, and that is why you blame desire. So he completely switches to a positive approach to this.
Okay, so you talked about D'Annunzio's novels, and of course another work that you talked about a lot is Pascoli's Poemi Conviviali, and it's work that we've also been translating in this way across the world. So I think at this point we want to read some of the poems, right? Or are you going to read some?
No, I think we're going to maybe talk a bit about them before.
Translation? Well, I mean, you want to say something about it? Because I don't have much to say about the translation. Maybe after I read one, I can say what I've done. And then,
okay, yeah. Well, maybe we'll talk about the Conviviali a little bit and then
okay,
we'll go to this. Yeah. So why I chose this particular set of poems by Giovanni Pascoli is not one of the most famous ones, but to me it's one of the most beautiful. It's because Poemi Conviviali is a set of long poems that deal with the antiquity, so figures from the Roman and Greek world. For Pascoli, the antiquity was somehow the Bible of Western society, so in all of those stories and myths, he saw all the features of Western society. Obviously, desire is one of them, so I wanted to follow the fil rouge of desire there. And in fact, I found that it's extremely prominent because what he narrates there is two things. One of them, the mechanism of desire is a slippage, and the other thing that he offers there is a possible solution to the problem of desire. Most of these characters in the Conviviali are figures of the antiquity, but they are imbued with a modern sensitivity. So they're somehow figures of himself and figures of the modern man. And all of them, the poems are also full of extremely uncanny female figures. Mostly at the end of the poem, there's always a sisterly or motherly figure that awaits the character at the end of his journey or at the end of his life. These figures are particularly uncanny in the Freudian sense. They're homely, they're welcoming, they're feminine, but they're also deadly. Because at the bifurcation of every desire for Pascoli, there's this desire, there's this wholeness, this return to childhood. But in life, it is not possible. It gestures towards death. So this quest for wholeness, it's always backwards, always towards the past, is bound to shipwreck the subject. That's why I called somehow my chapter the shipwreck of the subject. And some of the poem perfectly exemplifies that. One of them is the one about Ulysses. We know Ulysses is somewhat a figure of an explorer, somebody who would go forward. But for Pascoli, he goes backwards. He's old in his Ithaca, and then he wants to go back to the things he saw when he was young. He doesn't want to discover more things. He wants to go back. So he sets on a quest to go back to exactly the places he saw. But he saw that they're no longer what they were. So they were better in memory than in reality. And in the end, he shipwrecks. And where does he shipwreck? In an island of Calypso, where this woman awaits for him. This woman that is what the end point of his search, but it's also death. And the same thing happens with Alexandros, so we may want to read that because I think poetry is probably the better way of explaining this. This is the handout taken from our already published translation.
Should I read this one?
You read, yes, just the
translation.
Just the translation. I don't really have
It's not that bad. Okay, Alexander. 1. Just wait for 2 seconds. 1. We have arrived, the end. Herald, proclaim it. No further earth than that up in the heavens, that crescent that now shines down on your shields. My soldiers, a wandering earth, forsaken, unreachable. And from this final shingle, you see it there, my mercenaries and pikemen, that final stream that runs without a wrinkle. O you who come from Haimon and Carmelis, look how this earth dissolves and starts to mingle with the midnight sky, with its shining darkness. Streams that I forded, you will carry with you the wood's silence, with you the river's murmuring will carry. Mountains that I climbed, and after you climbed them, the world you looked down on seemed less unbounded than it had seemed when it was hid behind them. Blue like the sky, blue like the sea, oh mountains, oh rivers, perhaps it would have been better to have your dreams and not to look beyond them. A dream is an endless shadow on what's there. And I, happiest the longer the journey, the greater the doubts, the greater the hazards, the greater the fortune that lay before me. At Issus, when the winds stirred up the banners in the dead of night, and the soldiers waiting, their chariots dark in the endless ford. At Pella, when, through never-ending evenings, we followed, oh, my old bull-headed stallion, the sun, which, with the forest shadows growing longer and longer, burned like a treasure. Philip, my father, of ends I had no inkling back then when I began, but I remember altars, a hymn, Timotheus intoning. It's with me still, a captivating whisper, to journey beyond death. My heart preserves it, the way a seashell holds the ocean's murmur. O piercing sound, O captivating spirit that stays with us and bids us seize the challenge. But this is the end, the ocean, the limit. The song has passed on over us and vanished. And now, arrived at the end, he weeps, breathless. He cries from the one eye as black as Hades, and from the other as blue as the sky is. So it is always, for so it is fated. In the black eye dwells hope, always the weaker. In the blue eye, desire, still undefeated. He hears the dumb beasts lowing in the distance. He hears vague forces, unknown, unabated, passing by him across the enormous lowland, like a vast herd of elephants migrating. Meanwhile in Epirus, up in the mountains, his maiden sisters are twirling their spindles. They are spinning wool for their distant kinsmen. Late every night they are twisting their spindles with the other woman, with waxen fingers. Outside the wind blows and the starlight twinkles. His mother Olympias, lost in slumber, listens to the chattering of the fountain, listens in the limitless hollow shadows to the oak trees whispering on the mountain.
Yes. So we can see in this poem the mechanism of desire, the constant calling to go beyond, which is also a voice. It's something, it's not, it's only the voice of the sea, the sound of the seashell, something that calls you to go beyond, but it's what Lacan called l'objet petit. It's that glitter that moves from one thing to the next. And at the end of the poem, the woman, the figure, the sister, the weave with her waxen fingers, and the mother lost in slumber. And this element of the sound and the voice as a metaphor for the glitter of desire, what Lacan again called l'objet petit, which is not the object still, but one particular thing of the object that makes you want the object, is often portrayed as a voice in the Conviviali. The other poem that we wanted to read is Antiklos. And Antiklos is, to me, particularly interesting for two things. One, because of this theme of the voice, and the other one, because it offers a solution to desire. So as to the voice, I have another Fitzgerald quote, because I found out that Fitzgerald has a lot of desire in quotes, and I found them beautiful. The voice is, for Lacan in particular, Lacan also talks about voice, but the voice is what makes you desire, or a human being is the voice, because it has a little bit of your inner soul, but it's not the whole thing. So it's filled with desiredness. This is taken from the Great Gatsby, and I think nobody says it better than Fitzgerald when he says that, talks about the voice of Daisy Buchanan. I think that voice held him most with its fluctuating, feverish warmth because it couldn't be overdreamed. That voice was a deathless song. In Conviviale there is a deadly song, a deadly voice. We are at the end of the Trojan War, and the Trojan soldiers are inside the wooden horse, outside of the walls of Troy, waiting to get in. Helen of Troy, on the other hand, comes out of the walls of Troy and goes around the horse and speaks with her voice, which to every soldier sounds like the voice of their woman. She has this trick, this magic in the poem, and to trigger them to come out, to trick them into coming out of the horse. Anticlo is one of them, and he hears this voice, and he's fascinated by it, and he wants this voice because it reminds him of the woman at home. So again, the wholeness behind the woman. When he dies, he wants Ellen to come and speak to him with the voice of his woman. But when he sees her, he says, I don't want to hear the voice of my wife, I want to hear your voice alone. And here we talk about one way, the only way in which desire can be halted, in which the mechanism of slippage can be halted, by freezing it, by contemplating it before reaching its fulfillment. In one way, memory is this, and poetry does this. It puts the object in front of the subject without giving it to him. And that's the only way in which we don't fall into the trap of the metonymical slippage. In one way, poetry acts to the sort of similar to what memory does. A lost object is always an object lost in time. All poetry for Pascal is memorial. It talks about dead things, things that are no more, things that were. And that's the only way in which the wholeness can be experienced as a glimpse without the disappointment of actually achieving what it is. So we may maybe want to read Anticlos.
Yeah, so just to comment, that was a good introduction, but I mean, just to comment on the translation.
Oh, sorry.
No. Just because you might notice that Alexander, this is the first one we did, I think, and at this point, I think I was quite keen to try and get the formal features the same. So there's a hendecasyllable, it's 11 syllables, and it has a certain rhyme scheme. So in this one, I tried very hard to get the rhyme scheme right, and I swear these lines all have 11 syllables, and they should. And then by the time we're going backwards in time away, but by the time we did Anticlos, we were a bit lazier. I mean, this poem in Pascoli's writing is a bit looser anyway in terms of the rhymes, but you can tell we've shifted to this sort of 4-beat, very loose 4-beat English line, which sometimes is dactylic, sometimes it's anemic. So for people who care, for people who like the technical details, you can notice this is a bit looser. Okay, so Anticlos. Inside the wooden horse, Anticlos cried out in response to that heavenly voice he heard. Or he would have cried out, if Odysseus hadn't covered his mouth, saving the heroes. Till, still calling out those heroes' names, that winged voice faded into the distance. And finally, all that could be heard was the short breathing of the heroes, just like before, when they were entranced by the enormous hubbub of the waking day, by the crystalline singing of choruses of girls, which they listened to in the dark of night. Then it disappeared, because maybe it was night, and the evening star was already shivering over the sea. Maybe it was night, with a full moon rising out of the hills.
You don't have that.
Then I'll just stop in the middle of 1 and 2. Then there it was, a voice that circled the wooden horse, and it sounded like the voice that each man most wanted to hear. Every heart has a voice it longs for most. So this is number 2. It was the woman that each of them loved, the far-off, unreachable woman they loved, suddenly appearing from across the sea waves and the dark mountains, suddenly there, and each man jumped like he was placing a foot on the mossy doorstep of his home. A look from Odysseus reined them all in, all but Anticlos. Anticlos was a force, but only because he was forced to be. No tales of glory babbled in his heart, just slender cypresses, a sunny vineyard, and his woman, whose voice he now heard, and she was there across the dark mountains, across the sea waves, and she was pushing the loom away and coming up the stairs. The door was opening, and he opened his lips, and the heavy hand of Odysseus shut them, the man with 100 tricks and ways. Then he heard in the seashell of his ear a harsh whisper, like a cold sea breeze. "It's Helen! Helen! Death, you fool!" But the voice stayed with him, and when, with the others, he left the horse, the full moon hanging in the middle of the night, the heart within him was blackening with rage. Everywhere he went, he killed, burnt down, destroyed. He tipped the sacred tripods into the fire, drove his sword through maidens' breasts. He didn't want captives. All he wanted was to hear, through screams and cries and groans, the voice of the woman he loved, his own. But now he was in holy Troy, enemy of glory, and not in Arne, rich in grapes, or in Haliartus, leafy. And Troy went down in a whirlpool of blood, while the moon looked on serenely. The warriors dead, the children were thrown into the smoking rubble, the women were dragged to the waiting ships. And from Troy in flames to the sky-blue sea, through the Sigean gates, white in the moonlight, the chariots passed, and the cries went on. But Antiklaus didn't pass through those gates, nor any other in the walls of Troy. His charioteer waited for him in the gilded chariot with a fresh young slave, wailing wildly. And the horses, their reins tied to a fig tree the wind whistled through, stamped their hooves on the dusty ground, sniffed at the blood, reared at the flames. But Antiklaus did not come. He lay in a dark pool of blood in the high house of Deiphobos, son of Priam. And over him there raged still the lust of battle, the clash of bronze, since in the fatal footsteps of Paris, the warriors who came in 1,000 ships, from Locris, Aetolia, Phocis, Dolopia, still fought with the Trojans over Argive Helen, still struck at each other with their shadowed spears, the bronze-clad, the tamers of horses, as their spears clashed and their long shadows stood out like scars on a city in flames. But Antiklaus thought of his woman as he lay there dying in the sonorous hall of that great house, which now went up like a tottering pine devoured by flame. And through the chaos, Antiklaus saw Lytus standing in the doorway. Immediately he called to him, "Lytus, son of Electryon, find Menelaus, the conqueror, whose mighty cry of war I hear. Tell him the blood leaks from my veins like wine out of a broken jug. Tell him that I'm dying for him, and for his woman, though I have mine in my heart. Tell him to bring Helen to speak to me in the voice of my woman, the voice that I most want to hear. Every heart has a voice that it longs for most." So he spoke, and Lytus passed through the house, tracking that mighty cry of war. And when it went quiet, he found Menelaus, leaning on a spear that ended in a wound, with his foot on the corpse of his enemy. And there sat Helen silently, high on a throne of solid gold, her feet up on a golden footstool. Lytus said to Menelaus, "Somebody sent me whose blood is leaking, like wine out of a broken jug. Antiklaus, who's dying for you, and for your woman, though he has his in his heart. So please, let Helen go to speak to him in the voice of his woman, the voice that he most wants to hear. Every heart has a voice that it longs for most." So it was that as Antiklaus lay dying, Helen came to him, silently as a dream. Around her the conflagration blazed, and above the conflagration shone the moon. And she passed silently, serenely as the moon, over the blood and flames. The flames soared higher as she passed, the blood cooled in the dying veins. The last houses came crashing down, men's last gasps hung on the air. She stood over Antiklaus where he lay dying, thinking of his woman far away. The warriors fell silent, hoarse from the war cry. The slave girls fell silent in their torn robes. And her mouth was just about to open with that faraway voice, the voice of his woman, so that he could carry it with him to Hades. Her lips were opening when Antiklaus said, "Stop! I want to remember you alone, the one that my heart has longed for most."
Okay, so we see here the same way. Very enigmatic finale, many scholars have tried to interpret why doesn't he want to achieve his dream? Why does he want to hear the voice of his woman? He just prefers not to fulfill his desire because it's in the by holding it without fulfilling it, there is no dissatisfaction, and the grip of wholeness remains intact. And another thing about translation that came about when you were reading this is that the other challenge of translating Pascoli is that there are so many languages in each word. There's Latin, there's Italian, and also there's the sound of it. So it's really, in one way, a great challenge to change it into English because we want to keep all of those. And sometimes it's impossible. Sometimes there's a solution that works. Like one of the examples is the word fragile that Pascoli uses in 3 senses. In one way, as the Latin, the sense we have, fragile as something easily, that it is fragile, but he also uses in Latin, which is something that makes a crushing sound. And at the same time, the word itself, fragile, has that sound in Italian. So sometimes we are faced with challenges of this kind, but this is what makes it so beautiful.
Fabulous. And can I, as a sort of final wrapping up questions, before maybe opening to the floor, because I think people may well like to ask you more about this, fantastic new reading of Pascoli and D'Annunzio. Can I bring you back to D'Annunzio and ask you what you think about, and in particular, Forse che sì, forse che no. And is that novel a representation of an annihilation of desire, or is it a novel without desire?
It's a novel in which the only solution to desire is brought about, the turning of the man into a machine, as I said. So the narrative seems to be the same. There's still a man entangled with a woman, and the man is no longer a poet or a dandy or an amateur artist, but he's a pilot of a plane. Planes were new at the time, so in one way, it's not. It's really like somehow. It also reflects D'Annunzio's new experiences with these machines and his then involvement in World War I, in which he became a pilot of planes, and. The woman brings him down. The woman keeps it on the earth, both metaphorically and really, because when he's with her, he doesn't fly anymore. It stays with her for hours in their summer villa, making love and talking, and he's so kept away from what really defines a man, kept away from his male friends. We see also here a cult of virility being brought about. It takes us straight to fascism in one way. Women need to be out of the male space. The male space is the only one in which heroism and deed are done. And finally, his male friend dies, and this one acts as a call, a wake-up call for the man who goes back to flying. And while he's out flying, we find out that the woman is not just sensual, but she's also degenerate because she's having a relationship with her brother. So this is all narrative. When he finds out, when the main protagonist finds out, he really cut his ties with a woman who becomes crazy and deranged and goes into an asylum. And in the last scene, he flies again, and when he flies, it's not just an ordinary flight. During the flight, we have a metaphor in which the pilot turns into his own machine. So in the last flight, he finally lands in Sardinia, so he manages a long flight for the time, to cross the Mediterranean and lands in Sardinia. And the whole flight is portrayed as the progressive transformation of his body into a metallic body. And that body is finally free, and as we see in the quote, is at harmony with the universe. While the woman is the ranger in the asylum, is no longer tying him to the earth and to the brute. His body is no longer a human body, it's a metallic body. So we see two things here. Obviously the idolization of, proto-futuristic idolization of new mechanical means, but also, in one way, the Darwinian paradigm still at play, but gets put completely onto the woman. That then it's charged with all the negativity, with the brute within, but also the woman is significantly portrayed as a decadent artist, because she's the one who tells the story, she's the one who's a poet, but in the end she's the one who gets defeated. But the only way that she can be defeated is by him turning into a metallic body. And that's the end point of his solution to desire is this. And interesting, D'Annunzio proceeded to enroll in the war, which he saw. There's actually a study at Bonadeo, D'Annunzio la Grande Guerra, D'Annunzio the Great War, in which he traces back D'Annunzio's diaries in what he saw the war as a way of, in a way, channeling his extra energy, in particular his erotic impulses, which seemed to torment him. So you see, the war is a purifying experience, a bloodshed that would finally give him a purpose in life.